In May of 2002, I had been working at the Office of Secretary of Defense in the Undersecretariat for Policy, Sub-Saharan Africa, and I was very happy there. But in May of 2002, I was drafted to come join a sister office, the Near East South Asia office. Eventually, I was given the job of the North Africa Country Desk, and in that role, I became exposed for the very first time in my life to the politics that were happening, that were present in the Pentagon regarding the Middle East, because now I was working in the Middle East Directorate, Middle East Policy Directorate. My boss was Bill Lute. Above him, of course, Doug Feith. But my eyes were open to what was going on in Middle Eastern policy. When I was in Sub-Saharan African Affairs, we never saw Mr. Feith. We never received taskings from Mr. Feith. There was no involvement whatsoever of Mr. Feith. There was no involvement of Dick Cheney in the Office of Sub-Saharan African Affairs. All that was very different, and it was noticeably different when I moved over into Near East South Asia. It surprised me, and I was just amazed at what I saw, and I researched what was happening. Some of the things that were happening were the population of that office of politically minded people, political appointees, far beyond the usual concentration of political appointees that you would find in the Office of Secretary of Defense. There was very much a concentration of political appointees in general, specifically a concentration of political appointees of what I call and what most people recognize as a neoconservative political persuasion with regards to foreign policy. These were people in the Pentagon with a foreign policy agenda, and they were concentrated in the Near East South Asia office, at least noticeably so. They may have been elsewhere as well. But we were planning, this office was planning, making policy to support what I call propaganda campaign to convince the American people that we needed to invade Iraq. This had been going on before I joined them. May of 2002, I wasn't paying attention to it. It had been going on before that. In fact, it's well known now that Iraq was brought up on the afternoon of 9/11. I mean, after that happened, we're saying, well, how can we use this, the Pentagon and Secretary of Defense, how can we use this to go into Iraq? But I was unaware of that until I saw it firsthand with my own two eyes. So this agenda that was being worked, by the time I arrived there, was very much a developed agenda. The political appointees were in place. What I saw was the focus and a great deal of energy used to develop and create propaganda. Now, propaganda is a harsh word. It's something that, yes, government does use it, and I was not unfamiliar with the idea of putting a popular spin or putting a positive spin on information. But what I saw in the Near East South Asia office, particularly with Bill Lute, and eventually when the Office of Special Plans was formed under Abe Shulsky, was a very much focused program of developing propaganda. And that propaganda was aimed to convince people, both within the Pentagon, military people within the Pentagon and others, people at State Department, people at the NSC, and the American people, that Iraq was somehow complicit in the attack of 9/11, which of course we know is not true, but that was one of the messages that was being developed, and that Iraq was a major weapons of mass destruction threat, not just to its neighbors, not just to the region, but to the United States of America. This was part of the agenda. Now, working as a policy analyst, a political military officer, which I had been doing for years before that, you know, we had lots of exposure to intelligence. And even when I was in Sub-Saharan Africa, we still got global intelligence, which would include Iraq. And then in NESA, Near East South Asia, we would have general regional intelligence. So I was used to looking at intelligence, and I had, you know, obviously in 1991, we had invaded Iraq. So Iraq is obviously something that we have intelligence reporting on continuously for the last decade, the last 12 years. What I saw was not the use of this intelligence as information, as analyzed recommendations or supporting fact, but the use of this intelligence to provide bits and pieces of a propaganda story that was being created. And it was being created where I was working in the Near East South Asia office. It was being created by Bill Lute's office. When the Office of Special Plans in August of 2002 physically relocated out from where we were and moved up into different spaces under Abe Shulsky, formally under Abe Shulsky, one of the major products that they provided to us as a sister office, again at that point, was a set of talking points that we action officers, political military officers, would utilize when we prepared any kind of policy paper, any kind of information paper that we would be presenting to our higher-ups, to visitors and guests, anything like that. These papers would include verbatim these talking points that would be provided by Abe Shulsky's office. These talking points were drawn from intelligence, because I'd seen the intelligence, most of it, I mean, at least up to the secret level, and these talking points were never classified higher than secret. But the information in there drawn from fact, you could find bits and pieces of fact throughout, but framed, articulated, crafted to convince someone of what? Well, of things that weren't true. Things that weren't true. 9/11, Al-Qaeda related to Saddam Hussein, possibly some involvement there. The very things that a year later President Bush himself denies and feigns his surprise. I don't know why everybody thinks that. Well, I worked in a place where they concentrated on preparing this storyline and selling it to everyone that they could possibly sell it to, and ensuring that it was not used as a suggestion. It was not used in part. We were mandated that we would take these talking points and include them in their entirety into every paper that we gave to our higher-ups to prepare them to talk to people outside the Pentagon. So that's just one small part, but it was very interesting in that we in the Pentagon, uniformed people and professional civilians, were also being propagandized as well as the American people. And I think that's what really kind of caused me to look around and find out what was going on, because while 20 years in the military working for government, of course, the government puts a positive spin on what it does. It tries to deny guilt until the very last minute. I understand that. I've been a party to that. That's propagandizing other people outside of government, the taxpayer, the customer, whoever it is, the media. I had never seen where that kind of propaganda was actually aimed inside of the Pentagon, and it was. It was aimed at everyone outside of this small circle of political activists in the Pentagon. And of course, I needed to know more, and I studied these folks. I studied their backgrounds. I read all I could about Richard Pearle. At the time I was there, he was the chairman of the Defense Policy Board, no longer the chairman, but he's still a strong member. I read all I could about Mr. Feith, Doug Feith, formerly of Feith and Zell, whose only overseas client was the country of Israel. So, I looked at these things. I said, what do we know about these people and their agendas? And their agendas were wide open. They were out there. Richard Pearle had published a co-written document in 1996 called A Clean Break, a Strategy for Securing the Realm. It was a document, it's still out on the internet. It was a document that he and others, and some of the others are people that I also knew in the Pentagon, or they had received political appointments over at the State Department. He had written this document as part of Benjamin Netanyahu's campaign strategy, kind of helping look at what kind of security long-term strategies would be adopted, would be suitable for Benjamin Netanyahu to proclaim as he ran in this campaign in 1996. And if you read that, you will see that we need regime change in Iraq. Well, it's 1996. Okay, fine. That's for Benjamin. What does that have to do with us? Well, it wouldn't have anything to do with us, except all the same people who were preparing these strategies and developing them and researching them and discussing them and trying to play them out in an academic environment, an intellectualized environment. Now, we're suddenly transplanted. They were in the Pentagon. And so they were no longer in an academic, intellectualized environment. They were in an empowered environment. And the things that they were doing seemed to track back to things that they had advocated in previous times as academics, as advisors who weren't politically empowered. So there was plenty of information out there, and the more I saw of the propaganda campaign to convince people that you know, Iraq is very dangerous to the United States, to the people of America, because of WMD, regardless of the fact that we didn't know what WMD had, regardless of the fact that the CIA had not pushed this forth. The CIA you had to knock on the CIA's door. I mean, Dick Cheney had to go to the CIA in person several times and say, look, this is what I'm looking for. Please give me this kind of stuff. And they produced some things, but if you look at what the intelligence community produced, I would stand by, in general, I would stand by the intelligence community in that what they produced was a very cautious and qualified assessment of where Saddam Hussein was going. In fact, a big part of that assessment was he's not going anywhere. He wanted to go some places, but due to sanctions, due to some other things, price of oil, whatever, he has not been able to succeed. That's what CIA was telling him. Of course, he didn't want to hear that. But I think the CIA did a fair job until they were pressured, until they were told, we need these kinds of reports. And of course, they're customer oriented. They're going to do what they're asked to do. The information was out there. The planning had been done long before the Bush administration came in. And I think in one way that explains why they were so successful in convincing the American people, so successful in populating the power centers within the Pentagon, within the State Department, within the NSC to a lesser extent, and certainly within the Vice President's office. I mean, there is these folks, it's a network in a positive way. I mean, it's a network. But it was a network that had been in place during the Clinton years. These same people worked on documents. The Project for a New American Century is another organization. Plenty of stuff's written out there. They have a website. And Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld were involved in that. A number of other neoconservative intellectuals were involved in developing the Project for a New American Century, basically a strategy for making America great. Well, we were already great, I guess, but making us even greater. And in these documents, if you look at the signatories to various products and the authors of various products that the Project for a New American Century had done, you look at the names. It's Cheney, it's Rumsfeld, it's Wolfowitz, it's all these guys. And so when they came in as a network of people that had worked together. Not unusual that you would have the party on the outs, and then when the party comes back in, political power, that of course they associated with each other during the out years. And in that sense, there's nothing crazy or dangerous about this, except that the agenda that they had was an agenda to take us to war. And it relied on lies. It relied on stories that had to be woven and created and told and sold to the American people. So I started working there in May of 2002, relatively quickly got up to speed on what was happening there. Of course, I was doing my job, so I wasn't like spending all my time researching neoconservatives. I mean, it doesn't take that long to read some of their basic documentation. In August, the Office of Special Plans formally stood up as an office, and Abe Shulsky was formally put in charge of them. And Abe, of course, is an academician. I mean, he's an intellectual, University of Chicago. He's a Straussian, very, very nice guy. Just, very nice person. Lovely person. But his philosophies, again, fit in perfectly with the agenda that they were pushing. In the fall, this office, after they moved into new spaces, they start producing these talking points. And my second big eye-opening event was as I looked at these talking points, and they were updated periodically. We couldn't reuse them over time. You would have a talking point for one meeting or an event. If a week later you had another meeting or event, you had to call back up, say, I need the freshest, most current version of the talking points. And so I got a chance to see them as they evolved, and it was interesting how they evolved. During that same time frame, as I'm looking at these products, I'm also listening to speeches by President Bush in Cincinnati, for example, or speeches by Dick Cheney to the friendly audiences. I think the Veterans of Foreign Wars was a very speech that got a lot of publicity that Dick Cheney had given. And you listen to these speeches, and as I'm listening to them on the radio or I'm reading them, I see the same, the same words. And that's great. That's huge political control. I mean, if you can keep everybody on the same board, that's great. But the things weren't true that they were saying. They were false. They were lies, creative storytelling. And yet, out of the president's mouth, vice president's mouth, the same things that were being given to us to put into our superiors, our senior civilian leadership's mouths, these things were not based on intelligence that we saw, that everyone saw. They were based on a very selective reading of the intelligence and then a creative packaging such that you could push through these two big points that the president and the vice president and the whole neoconservative community used to justify this preemptive war on Iraq, which was he has WMD, which is going to hit us soon, and he's conducting terrorism. He is planning and working actively with terrorists and probably did 9/11. Of course, we deny that now, but certainly that was the message that was put forth to the American people and put forth internally to all the rest of the untrusted people in the Pentagon, which is basically if you weren't a political appointee. The Joint Staff is full of generals and admirals and their military staffs and professional civilians. There's not as many political appointees in the Joint Staff as there is in the Office of Secretary of Defense. The Joint Staff was not a trusted entity because they didn't have, they couldn't be trusted to always say the right thing. So they were propagandized along with us. I mean, just amazing stuff. It's very clear that the Straussian, certain parts of Straussian's influence is felt throughout the heavyweights in the neoconservative community. And Wolfowitz is one of the really smartest guys, very much studied under, and Ahmed Chalabi, of course, which is not a heavyweight necessarily, but he studied under him. So it may be less of a. You really don't want to discredit. You really don't want to discredit.
Okay, we good? Yeah. When you were talking before about the talking points, I just have a quick question. I'm not sure about this. You've seen these things that were showing you that there were kind of things you were talking about that would play in a certain way as a propaganda campaign or as lies to justify the war. Bush was saying similar things. We now know there were lies. He's admitted it.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you to actually push back because I can see you in the window.
Oh gosh, all these windows.
Have I been in it the whole time?
No.
Because that'd be frightening.
Oh, I can turn that light off. Or you wanted the light on. Okay, okay.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, that's good.
All right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else? Or we're good?
It's always something.
Okay. Should I be moving over here now?
No, you were good where you were.
Okay.
All right. Did in those talking points or in any other way was it communicated that you shouldn't be making, these statements as if they're literally true? Was there any kind of correction built into the talking points that we're not saying that Saddam Hussein, had anything to do with 9/11? Was there any kind of
No,
instruction?
absolutely not. In fact, that's precisely what differentiated these talking points from real intelligence products that we're all in the military and in policy, you're all used to seeing legitimate intelligence products. And they're very often, when they go out on a limb, they're very cautious. This is the thing that infuriates policymakers, is because the intelligence community tends to be cautious. They don't go out there and say, here's what's happening. They say, here's what we think might be happening. And here's the evidence that we have, and then here's some things that tell us maybe we're wrong on this. Infuriates the policymakers in general. This is not, it's always that way. But intelligence is very much, adheres to a standard such that it stands up under scrutiny. It is not an intelligence product unless it has gone through the system and been vetted and checked and all those things. The material that we were seeing in the talking points was, I call it propaganda because it's the only thing it is most like. It is nothing like intelligence because it wasn't couched in anything. It was, things were insinuated in those talking points that would inspire fear in people, like fear of WMD attack. The same kinds of things that the president was saying in his Cincinnati speech, where he talked about unmanned aerial vehicle fleet that would deliver WMD from Iraq to America, that he could strike America. I mean, these are very fearful things, not based in fact, never based in fact, certainly not provided to him by the intelligence community, and yet crafted as if it was fact. Now, it's one thing for the president to use his bully pulpit to gain support for something that he wants to do. And he did lie to do that, but that's what presidents do sometimes. It's a very different thing for talking points within the Pentagon to be developed, doing the exact same thing, propagandizing other people, other organizations, the Joint Staff, other policymakers in government. and that's what we saw. There's a whole thing. There's a lot of things that you gain serving in the military. Because it's very bureaucratic. Okay, there's a lot of things about it that aren't good, but in the military, when we practice all the time, we practice things. We write articles about what we're going to practice. We do exercises, and always after these exercises, it's like sports. It's like in a football game. You go out and you play. You have a plan that you practiced, and you go out and play. And then after the game, you go back into the locker room, and if you lost, you get yelled at by the coach. And you look at all the stuff, and if the quarterback fumbled some passes or whatever, he gets yelled at. It doesn't matter if he's the captain. It doesn't matter if he's the best guy on the team. If he screwed up, he gets yelled at. And it's almost like in sports, where you can take the heat, and you do that for the good of the team. You look at what you did wrong, and you try to do it better next time. We have lessons learned. We practice. We have hot washes, they call them. All these things, and there's something I think that you gain from that none of the folks in our government today who are making these decisions understand. And so what happens is they personalize their performance very much. It becomes part of their identity and their value as a person. And so they're very reluctant to hear criticism. They're very reluctant to accept the fact that, you know what, they screwed up. Well, you know what, in Iraq, U.S. government planners screwed up. Did the military do fine? Yeah. CENTCOM did great. In fact, CENTCOM pulled some things out of the fire for these policy planners who had done a very poor job of preparing for what it might look like the day after, the week after. So the soldiers, we know how to do this. The soldiers know how to do it. They did fine. Okay. The part that was a failure is in both the agenda, which is a false agenda. American imperialism has no place in our tradition. We've been imperialistic in the past. It has always been an aberration for this country, and it's an aberration now. So pursuit of American empire, particularly a military empire, which is what the neoconservatives embrace, they see that as a destiny, is not part of the American tradition. Okay, so that's mistake number one. Okay, you tried to do something that the American people don't really want to do. That's one mistake. If you had a hot wash after the game, you could discuss this, and you could do so in a way that doesn't denigrate or reduce as people the people who advocated this. We just say, look, you made a mistake. We're not going to do that next time. Well, these people don't have that experience. In fact, it's funny. We call them chicken hawks because none of them served in the military. They didn't wear a uniform. They all had other things to do. None of their children served in the military. So this is a double chicken hawk whammy here because George Bush's daughters don't wear a uniform. It's funny, he says, my daughter's the same age as Jessica Lynch. Yeah, but there's a big difference. Jessica Lynch wore a uniform and did what you guys told him to do. Anyway, it's interesting that it's not just lack of military experience, it's lack of sports experience. And if you look at George Bush and Dick Cheney, and Rumsfeld's got it. Rumsfeld's a wrestler. That's an individual sport. Team sports, that's what they're missing. Because in team sports, people are allowed to make mistakes. And they're allowed to be criticized in the group and come back the next day knowing that, yes, you're a good player, but you really screwed up badly. And they can take that kind of criticism. These folks, and I'm going to tell you something here, that's it'll be off the wall. It's along with this sports analogy. There's a book that was written back in the early 90s, and I read it. It was a book on management for women. It's called Hardball for Women. That was the name of this book. And throughout the book, it used the team sports analogies as a way for women managers, women in management, to understand how the game is played in business, and to understand how men, stereotypical men, would proceed with decision-making, how they would move forward and act. And one of the things it pointed out, they said that in the early 90s and the 80s and the 70s, women had far less opportunity for team sports than they do today. And so the women in business in this 80s and 90s with men were at a somewhat of a disadvantage in that they never really had the experience, the formative experience of being part of a team that you're valued, but when you screw up, your performance can be criticized. And so they said what that leads to is women. This is off the subject of politics, but I think it does apply here, because there are no women neocons. There may be one. There's very few. But these men who are neocons fall into that same category of women, statistically, who have never played team sports. And what happens is, they said this in business, is that when they do a hot wash in business, we did a sales pitch and we expected 500, but we only got 200. So what happened? Somebody messed up. When they go around the room and point fingers, the men just take it. They're like, okay, coach, sorry, I'll do better next time. They don't take it personally. When they go into the showers, they're patting butts and doing the same thing they would have done otherwise, because they don't internalize this as a personal affront. But the women will take this criticism, public criticism, in the group, and take that with them and hold on to it for weeks and months and years at a time. What did I do wrong? Self-analysis, feeling bad, feeling embarrassed. And they said, if you play team sports with a coach and a captain and players that have roles to play, they say that you learn that criticism is not necessarily personalized. And then you welcome criticism as a way of improving overall team performance. So I would just say with these neoconservatives, it's not just that they didn't have military experience. They didn't have team sport experience. So they're very, very sensitive to any kind of criticism. They have yet, Wolfowitz to this day, Doug Feith in particular to this day, Bill Lute, of course, Dick Cheney is in total denial, will not admit that there were even the slightest bit of mistakes. Richard Pearle, another one that's never played a team sport, it doesn't, what is his reaction to criticism? Well, you don't know enough. You're not smart like me, and therefore you don't understand what we were doing. It was really right. It was just implemented poorly, or there was, always pushing the excuse out. Well, the fact of the matter is, every mistake that has been done, from the preemptive war doctrine, which is no doctrine, and certainly will not be sustained post-George Bush. Okay, this is certainly a mistake, historically unjustified. There's just no foundation for that. But not only is that a mistake, but lying to the American people for the whole year of 2002, entering this war on a shoestring with all these false expectations of how we would be greeted by the Iraqi people, and then the occupation, which is getting uglier and uglier and deadlier each day. All of these things constitute mistakes. And these are mistakes that Dick Cheney, George Bush, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Bill Lute, Abe Shulsky, Richard Pearle, Defense Policy Board, not a single one will even admit that it's a mistake. And I think they're afraid to, because from where they come from, with no military experience, no hot wash experience, no team sport experience, that if they admit it's a mistake, that it will be a crushing blow to their entire reputation, their political, who they are. I think it's very scary for them. International law doesn't matter to neoconservatives, in part because they haven't served in the military, and in part because they are not internationalists. So they don't recognize the idea of reciprocity. Reciprocity applies to free market and trading, which is reciprocity is a foundation of the global free market, or any free market. Whether it's you go downtown to buy something from your neighbor, same thing. Reciprocity, certain norms of behavior that allow you to be predictable to people or countries or organizations that don't know you very well. How can I know that you're going to be predictable? How can I know that when I give you 5 cents, you're going to give me 5 cents worth of product? If I don't know you, if I haven't conducted business with you, I may not know. But if I know that you and I both adhere to a certain standard that says when a person gives you 5 cents, you give them 5 cents back of product, then I can operate with you. This is the foundation of free trade. It's a foundation of diplomacy. It's a foundation of international relations. For neoconservatives, they discount internationalism in part because they fail to understand the market. There's no economists, okay? Find me an economist who is a neoconservative, and Lou Dobbs does not count because he's not an economist. And I would be very interested to talk to that person. I don't think you'll be able to find one. Most of the neoconservatives pay very little attention to the structures of market relations. They don't understand that. So because they're not sensitive to the market, they discount internationalism. They discount the idea of reciprocity. In terms of security, and behavior because they haven't served in the military. They discount the idea of having norms of war. They discount the idea of a just war. A just war is whatever I say it is, okay? That's what they prefer. Having never been a POW and never likely to be a POW, they don't understand that if you do not have rules that you can push towards, certainly you cannot achieve them, but the Geneva Convention was an attempt to prevent the barbarism that had occurred in Europe with these great wars, the Great War and World War II. So the Geneva Convention is there to provide a semblance of reciprocity so that your soldiers are not tortured and my soldiers, your POWs are not tortured and my POWs are not tortured. Well, this administration is very ignorant of what internationalism is. They see it only as a negative. They see it as letting the UN tell you what to do. Certainly that's nothing to do with it. They don't understand reciprocity. They've never served in the military or ran their own business in the sense of being sensitive to the marketplace and what makes a marketplace work. Because they are ignorant of this, they discount its value.